Thank you. I hope everyone's had a good FLN. I'm excited to talk today about some research I've been working on at Clemson University's Forest Ecology and Fire Science Lab for the past 2 years. A little bit about me, I'm a recent graduate from Clemson, and my interest in fire started when I was on the coast in Georgia working for the Wildlife Resources Commission, conducting prescribed burns in longleaf pine forests. I'm going to go over what I'll be discussing today. I'm going to start with a broad introduction, fire terminology, before going into part 1 of 2 of my research, looking at delayed forest overstory mortality in the southern Appalachians, before switching over to looking at forest regeneration patterns. I'll end with research and management implications and take questions if we have time and interest. As we're all aware, fire is pretty central to shaping plant communities in the southern Appalachians. In different plant communities, there would be different fire return intervals, and in those sheltered mesic coves, you would experience less frequent fire in the landscape, and on the exposed south-facing slopes, you would experience more frequent fire in the landscape. The figure you're looking at here is from Nowacki and Abrams' paper, where they formally described mesification in the landscape, which I will go over later. But on the left-hand side, you can see we had those larger ecozones that were more formally, more homogeneous, or more heterogeneous, and have since switched in the, with the onset of mesification in the landscape due to wildfire suppression, to more homogenized zones. Wildfire suppression policy in the early 1900s essentially eliminated fire from the landscape, but that changed in the 1980s, and then of course the 2016 wildfire season, which I'm sure many of you are well aware of. Prior to the 2016 wildfire events, the region went through a period of extreme drought, leading to conditions favorable for an active wildfire season. In the left-hand figure, we see a burn area map from the season in the southern Appalachians. This is from a study conducted by Riley et al., showing us that more area burned in a time span of approximately 6 to 8 weeks than the previous three decades combined. The majority of these fires were slow-moving ground fires. Mesification, I'm sure most of you are aware of this term by now, is the process where those open, structured forests in the region, composed of oaks, hickories, and yellow pines, have transitioned into more dense, fire-suppressed forests. My overall objective with this study was to assess forest response to wildfire and long unburned forests of the southern Appalachians, and to assist land managers and scientists of the area. So I'm hopeful you'll be able to take something away from this. We're delving into part 1 of 2 of my research, where I'll be looking at forest changes in terms of what was lost in the primary canopy due to fire effects. Limited research in the southern Appalachians has been conducted on wildfire, although we do have we have some research on prescribed fire as we've seen earlier. Is there a mouse on the laptop? Do we know? I guess I want to scroll down on my notes.
Oh, that's just what you from the purple.
Okay, I can impress. I have 3 areas of interest for my study for part 1. One, looking at wildfire effects on plant functional groups, separated by fire adaptation traits. So your fire-tolerant species based on bark thickness, growth rate, and shade tolerance. and as well as fire-sensitive species with a similar criteria. Our temporal trends, Western studies indicate that a longer time frame is important to see cumulative effects from delayed overstory mortality, or from wildfire effects, with some studies indicating over 7 years is important to see these effects. The majority of our delayed forest overstory mortality studies on the East Coast only look at 1 to 3 years post-burn. And then thirdly, I wanted to look at increasing periods, with increasing periods of drought, what does thermal stress to the landscape, how does that influence mortality patterns? My study site is Rock Mountain Wildfire, which was the second largest burn of the 2016 wildfire events. It was approximately 10,000 hectares, or about 38 square miles. It started near Clayton, Georgia, in the Chattahoochee National Forest, and burned up in elevation and ended in the Nantahala. This is a representative fire of this season, a slow-moving, smoldering ground fire across most all topographic positions. It has representative topography and plant community of the area, excluding some of those higher elevation plant communities. 90 permanent plots were installed the year following wildfire, with 45 10 by 10 meter plots within the wildfire perimeter and 45 outside of the wildfire perimeter for a control. Annual mortality was measured intensively the first few years following fire and tapered off over time, with qualifying trees at 10 centimeters at DBH being measured for diameter, mortality status, whether they were alive or dead, as well as their species were recorded. I'm not going to get into my statistical methods, but I implemented Bayesian hierarchical logistic regression, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to discuss at any point. But it's a very powerful and intuitive tool that answers ecological questions in a more direct way. Oh. Here we go. To prepare data for analysis, I grouped species into functional groups based off fire adaptation traits. Where fire tolerant, were grouped with thick bark, slow growth speed, and shade intermediate tolerance, such as our oaks and hickories. And the species you might associate with mesification, red maple and tulip poplar, are fire sensitive with thin bark and fast resprouting ability, as well as some shade tolerance. And I separated out sourwood, which is consistently classified as a mesophyte in the literature, however, has some fire adapted species traits as well, so I separated it out. It makes up a large portion of the forest mid to overstory, but it does qualify at that 10 centimeter at DBH cutoff for me. Data was collected every year, almost every year, but I wanted to analyze differences in temporal patterns, so I grouped years into an early period and a later period after fire, with the first 3 years, 2017 through 2020, for the early period, and years 5 through 8 post-fire for the late period, for years 2021 and 2024. I created a heat load index similar to what Armin was describing earlier by McCune et al., a very powerful index that measures thermal stress to the landscape, with the red areas being your more exposed sites, and the blue being your cooler sites. So my results. So before I get into it, it's a bar graph or a bar chart where on the x-axis I have my groups, and then on the y-axis is percent predicted mortality. The light gray is our unburned, and the dark gray is our burned. OR stands for odds ratios, and that essentially is a simple way to compare the odds of a specific event like mortality occurring in one group versus another. And as expected, fire significantly affects all functional groups, but the magnitude varies substantially. We're not surprised to see these. However, our fire tolerant odds ratios lay at 2.2, so they're 2 times more likely to undergo a mortality event in the burned area versus the unburned. Our fire-sensitive group has approximately 43 times the likelihood of undergoing a mortality event in comparison with the unburned. And our sourwood has approximately 13 times the likelihood of undergoing a mortality event compared to the unburned. We do have some interesting background mortality for fire-tolerant species. I don't know this, but I think it might just be old age for our oaks and hickories, because we are seeing changes in the landscape regardless of wildfire. Between groups, it's a simple division to find an odds ratio for between groups, but our fire-sensitive species are 20 times more likely to undergo mortality than our fire-tolerant species. But sourwood shows a more intermediate response with 6 times the likelihood of undergoing mortality more than fire-tolerant, but 4 times less likely than fire-sensitive. So this is a major take-home, and I think a new finding is that delayed mortality doesn't just occur in the first 3 years following wildfire. It continues to occur over time, and it in fact increases in years 5 through 8 in the southern Appalachians. This aligns with research conducted out west, where they see that it takes multiple years to see cumulative effects of damage to individual trees from wildfire. In our chart, just to explain what we're seeing here, the dark line again is our burn, and the light is the unburned, and on the left-hand side is the early period, and on the right is the late period. The y-axis is mortality hazard risk, and wildfire effect on mortality incurs a predicted mortality rate of about 14.4% in the early period, which essentially doubles in the later period. And then looking at our thermal stress patterns, so this is for cumulative forest overstory mortality over all 8 years for all species. On our left-hand side is our sheltered cove forests and bottomland hardwood forests, and on the xeric is our exposed ridge tops and south-facing slopes. And this shows that fire-induced mortality odds increase approximately 2 times from those mesic sites to xeric sites, going from 23% probability to 51% probability. This demonstrates that thermal stress helps determine post-tree fire survival. And just to note that many of these trees that were measured were alive immediately following the wildfire. So the effects you see here occur after the initial burn. So the mortality might have more to do with effects in the landscape after the fire. All right, so we just looked at our losses in the forest, but what does the forest stand to gain? So to look at forest regeneration, I have a similar methods in situ. We measured all seedlings and saplings less than 2.5 centimeters in diameter at DBH in 90 plots within 3 different watersheds. Data was collected 8 years following wildfire, so instead of yearly measurements like part 1, we were just looking at a snapshot in time, almost a decade after the fire. For each 3 by 3 meter subplot, species stem count, species identification, and plant community were recorded. So this is a big take home for me, and it was unexpected for me, but I'm sure many of you in the field might be seeing this, that it's counterintuitive that fire promotes fire-sensitive species. And what we're seeing here is the orange are fire-tolerant species, and the blue are fire-sensitive. On the left-hand side is our unburned, and the right is our burned, with the y-axis showing just raw regeneration in stems per hectare. So that's approximately, so the interesting part is the statistically significant fire-sensitive species bar that shows 31,000 stems per hectare which equates to about 12,000 stems per acre. Or if you were to evenly distribute those stems over an acre, conceptually that looks like 1 stem for every 2 feet. To split these out into different plant communities, I ran a generalized linear mixed effects model and looked at relative abundance, thinking about shifts in forest like species within each of these plant communities. And the black is the burned and the white is the unburned. And on the left-hand side, again, we have our bottom limb cove forests, and on the right-hand side, we have our xeric ridge tops and south-facing slopes. The burn in the unburned, excuse me, I misspoke, the black is the unburned. But in the unburned area for our fire-tolerant species specifically, we see significant increase in our fire-tolerant regeneration in the unburned areas of the site of thermic oak communities, whereas we have a decrease in these fire-tolerant species, specifically in thermic oak plant communities or historically fire-maintained systems. And switching to our fire-sensitive species, our red maples and tulip poplars, in the black unburned, we have a decrease in relative abundance in fire-sensitive seedlings and saplings over this topographic gradient. In the white burned, we see a reflection of the bar chart we saw earlier, where we have a significant increase in those fire-sensitive species in historically fire-maintained systems, but in the unburned, we have a decrease as we go up that topographical gradient. So these are counterintuitive regeneration patterns, and results suggest a potential acceleration of mesification in response to a single wildfire event in the southern Appalachians under extreme drought conditions. One thing I might not have mentioned earlier is these droughts were preceded by extreme drought, so KBDI was 600 to 800 at the very extreme of the drought index. Results may be due to something called a resilience debt, which is a diminished capacity for ecological systems to recover from disturbance following a long break in historical disturbance regimes. This backs up a Carpenter et al. Study conducted at the same site, Rock Mountain, where they assessed mycorrhizal associations and if they were a benefit or a liability after nearly a century of fire exclusion. And yeah, they found similar patterns underground, where by burning in a fire-excluded forest hindered fire-tolerant species and disproportionately killed those fire-tolerant species such as oaks and yellow pines. So implications for natural resource managers and agency is, in the absence of additional management, I do think it's pretty clear where our forests are headed. So we have that loss in fire-tolerant species in the overstory, but a gain in those fire-sensitive species in the understory. So we see a shift in forest composition from those fire-tolerant to fire-sensitive. And does this align with management goals? You know, and how are we going to use fire as a management goal moving forward if we just let fire burn in an area hoping for the regeneration that we want? And this study also highlights the differences in impacts between wildfire and prescribed fire, which typically occurs in a lower, more controlled, lower KBDI and higher humidity environment, which have less severe impacts, even when the wildfire is otherwise smoldering or low flame lengths. And then I think a big takeaway is this is not just an event that occurs immediately when the wildfire happens, but impacts to the forest structure and composition are occurring over time. Like almost a decade, we see fire effects continuing. In my study, I saw a loss of 50% of our canopy on those exposed ridge tops and south-facing slopes, and delayed mortality in later periods, increasing fuel loads. It was interesting to see in the field. Some of the plots were even inaccessible. And with that, I'd like to wrap up, and thank you for your time.